The humid air of the Savannah probate court felt like a physical weight against my skin. I sat in court, silently, expecting to be committed until my lawyer played one video that made my father freeze, my brother's smirk die, and my mother turn paper, white on the spot. Revealing the trap hidden in plain sight, Benedict looked away first, his surgical precision failing him as his hands began to shake. My mother's silk handkerchief remained frozen against her cheek. They had underestimated the quiet sister for the very last time. The war started 3 months ago in a room that smelled of old leather and generational secrets. We gathered for the reading of my grandfather's will. A testament that shocked everyone but me. He left the entire $15 million estate and his private art collection solely to me, the quiet artist who lived in the carriage house. Benedict did not inherit a single dime. Neither did my parents. The polite veneer of the Vance family cracked instantly, revealing a jagged rot beneath their expensive, tailored clothes. My mother, Genevieve, dried her eyes the second the lawyer stepped out. She didn't look at me with pride, but with a terrifying, predatory intensity. She claimed Benedict was in deep trouble with dangerous people, and demanded I sell the estate to save him. I realized then that I was never a daughter to them. I was merely a utility, a vessel they poured their shame into, so they could remain pristine. They needed me to be weak so Benedict could stay the golden child. 3 days later, I walked into my studio and found my grandfather's masterpiece executed. The canvas was slashed into ribbons, and a jar of cadmium red paint had been thrown against the wall, like a gruesome crime scene. Benedict stepped from the shadows in his white lab coat, wearing a mask of tragic concern. He claimed I was spiraling, and called the police to report a manic episode. As the sirens wailed outside, he whispered that this was all for my own good. I didn't scream when the officers grabbed my arms. I became a stone, locking my jaw and offering my wrists without a single word of protest. Benedict's smile faltered when I refused to give him the theatrical breakdown he needed for his court testimony. He wanted a scene, but I gave him nothing but a blank stare and chilling silence. They put me in the back of the cruiser while he watched from the driveway. He looked disappointed that I had finally stopped playing his game. Now, as the video played in the courtroom, the truth filled the silence. The footage showed Benedict slashing the painting while laughing about his gambling debts. It captured my parents plotting to drug my wine and force a signature while I was unconscious. The judge leaned forward, his face hardening into a mask of pure disgust. Benedict tried to stand, but his legs gave out as the bailiffs moved toward him. I touched the cold recorder in my pocket and finally felt the weight lift. The bailiffs surrounded the defense table. Benedict looked toward the exit. Escape was gone. My father gripped the wood. He whispered to his lawyer. The lawyer stayed silent. The judge slammed his gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Silence fell again. Handcuffs clicked behind my brother's back. He finally looked at me. His eyes were hollow. My mother began to wail. She reached for my hand. I pulled it away. Police led them through the side door. I stood alone. The estate was finally mine. The courtroom emptied, leaving a hollow silence that felt heavier than the screaming. I stood by the defense table, watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of afternoon light. My lawyer squeezed my shoulder, but I didn't move. My objective was simple. I needed to retrieve the physical evidence before the clerks filed it away for the night. I walked toward the court reporter, my heels clicking like a metronome against the polished marble floor. The head clerk blocked my path with a frown. He clutched the digital drives to his chest like they were holy relics. He insisted that protocol required all exhibits to remain in state custody until the formal sentencing began next month. I explained that the original SD card contained penned personal files unrelated to the criminal case. He shook his head, citing a judicial order that froze everything. My family was gone, yet their legacy of bureaucratic red tape remained. A hand touched my elbow, startling me. It was the lead investigator, Detective Miller. He looked at the clerk and gave a sharp, authoritative nod. Miller told the man that the police already had bit copies and the originals could be released to the victim. The clerk relented, handing over the small plastic case with a grunt. I gripped the plastic tightly, feeling the sharp edges dig into my palm. It was the only proof I had. We walked toward the heavy oak doors. Miller asked if I had a safe place to stay tonight. I told him the main estate was finally empty. He warned me that Benedict's creditors wouldn't care about a court ruling. Those men were still looking their $15 million. And they didn't care whose name was on the deed. The golden child's debts were now my inheritance. My victory felt suddenly fragile as we stepped out into the humid air. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. I kept my head down, moving toward my car. I saw a black SUV parked across the street with tinted windows. It didn't belong to the press pool or the local police. The engine was idling, puffing a steady stream of exhaust into the thick Savannah heat. I fumbled with my keys, my heart hammering against my ribs. Someone was watching the house, and they weren't waiting for a formal tour. I reached my vehicle and locked the doors instantly. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was an unknown number. I hesitated before swiping to answer the call. A raspy voice on the other end didn't bother with a greeting. The man simply stated that Benedict had used the estate as collateral for a private loan. He said the court could take my brother, but they couldn't take his debt. The house was never truly mine to keep. The line went dead before I could reply. I looked back at the SUV, but it was already pulling away from the curb. I realized that my family's arrest was only the opening act of a much longer play. Benedict hadn't just tried to steal my future. He had sold it to people who didn't use lawyers. I put the car in gear and started the long drive home. Underneath the passenger seat, a small, forgotten tracking device began to blink red. I drove through the iron gates of the estate, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The long driveway was lined with ancient oaks that felt like sentinels guarding a graveyard. My objective was to reach the library and find the original deed before the creditors arrived. The humidity made the steering wheel slippery in my grip. I could feel the invisible weight of the tracking device beneath my seat. Every shadow in the trees looked like a waiting man. The front door was slightly ajar when I reached the porch. A cold chill replaced the heat of the afternoon. I stepped inside, my hand searching the wall for the light switch. The grand foyer was stripped of its warmth, smelling of damp wood and abandoned dreams. I noticed a single muddy footprint on the white marble floor. Someone had bypassed the security system with professional ease. My heart hammered as I realized I was not alone here. I reached the library and began tearing through the mahogany desk. My fingers brushed against heavy parchment and old ledgers, but the deed was missing. Suddenly, the heavy drapes rustled in the corner of the room. A man stepped out, holding a silver letter opener he had taken from the desk. He wasn't one of Benedict's bookies. He wore a tailored suit and held a leather folder. He looked more like a banker than a common thug. The man introduced himself as Silas, the estate's secret lien holder. He placed the folder on the desk and slid a single document toward me. It wasn't a loan for gambling debts as the caller had claimed. Benedict had used the property to fund an offshore clinic for experimental surgeries. My brother hadn't just been a gambler. He was a silent partner in a medical black market. The entire house was the collateral for a literal life and death debt. Silas told me that my grandfather had known about the secret clinic all along. He claimed the will was a test, not a gift. If I sold the house, the debt would be cleared. If I kept it, I was responsible for the patients still in the clinic's care. The power shifted as I realized my grandfather hadn't been protecting me. He had been passing me a ticking bomb. I stared at the signature on the bottom of the page. I looked at the dates on the clinical trials. The most recent entry was dated yesterday, even though Benedict was supposed to be locked in a jail cell. Someone was still operating the facility deep beneath the carriage house. Silas smiled, a thin and bloodless expression that didn't reach his eyes. He told me the sanctuary I wanted to build was already occupied by people who couldn't leave. The basement of my home was a prison for the broken and the nameless. I backed away from the desk, my mind reeling from the betrayal. The tracking device in my car wasn't for the creditors. It was a beacon for the medical transport team arriving tonight. Silas checked his watch and said the first shipment was 10 minutes away. I looked at the grandfather clock in the hall as it chimed. Underneath the familiar sound of the bells, I heard the faint, rhythmic thud of a heavy generator starting up underground. I sprinted toward the carriage house, my boots crunching on the gravel path. My objective was to find the entrance to the underground clinic before the transport team arrived. The humid air felt like a wet shroud clinging to my skin. I reached the heavy cedar doors and fumbled with the rusted padlock. Every second felt like a minute, as the low hum of the generator vibrated through the floor. The sun was dipping below the moss-covered trees. The padlock snapped, and I threw the doors open to the smell of cedar. I moved toward the back of the studio, where the floorboards were scuffed and uneven. My obstacle was a heavy metal workbench, bolted over the hidden hatch. I grabbed a crowbar from my tool rack and shoved it under the steel frame. My muscles screamed as I heaved against the weight. I finally heard the screech of metal sliding against wood. The hatch was exposed. I pulled the lever, and a section of the floor descended into a well-lit stairwell. I expected a dark dungeon, but I found a sterile, high-tech corridor instead. The walls were lined with frosted glass and polished chrome. This was no makeshift hideout. It was a professional surgical suite, built with millions of stolen dollars. I walked past rooms filled with monitors and life-support machines. The quiet hum was broken by the sound of a steady, rhythmic beep. I entered the final room and stopped a foot of a hospital bed. A woman lay there, her head wrapped in thick white bandages. Beneath the gauze, a distinctive birthmark on her chin confirmed the impossible. One I had seen in family photos since I was a child. It was my mother's sister, Aunt Claire, who had supposedly died in a car crash 3 years ago. Benedict hadn't just been running a clinic, he was keeping our own relatives as experimental subjects. The family secrets were breathing right in front of me. The power balance shifted when I noticed the tablet attached to the foot of the bed. It contained the logs for every procedure Benedict had ever performed on her. I scrolled through the files and found my own name, listed as a future donor. My brother hadn't framed me just for the inheritance money. He needed my biological markers to complete the final stage of his research. I was never the scapegoat. I was the primary source of raw material. I heard the sound of heavy tires on the gravel outside the carriage house doors. The transport team had arrived early, and I was trapped 3 stories below the ground. I looked for another exit, but the corridor only led deeper into the earth. Silas's voice echoed down the stairwell, calling out for the night shift nurses to prepare the patient. I realized then that Claire wasn't the only one they were planning to move tonight. They wanted me. I grabbed a scalpel from the tray beside the bed and hid in the shadows. The elevator began its slow, mechanical ascent back to the surface. I watched the floor numbers light up one by one. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. As the doors slid open, I saw 2 men in gray scrubs holding a heavy gurney. They weren't looking for Claire. They were looking at the spot where I was standing just seconds ago. I gripped the scalpel as the men stepped into the sterile light. My objective was to reach the emergency bypass switch near the oxygen tanks. The men moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency that suggested military training. They ignored the bandaged woman on the bed, their eyes scanning the shadows for me instead. One man touched his earpiece and whispered my name into the cold air. I pressed my back against the metal cabinet, praying the darkness would hold. The beeping monitor sounded like a countdown. The lead orderly kicked over a rolling stool, sending it skidding toward my hiding spot. I had to move now or be pinned against the wall. I lunged toward the oxygen station, my boots slipping on the polished floor. The second man intercepted me, his hand clamping around my throat with bruising force. He didn't speak a word as he began to lift me off the ground. My lungs burned for air while I flailed against his grip. I realized these weren't medical staff at all. I drove the scalpel into his forearm, feeling the blade sink deep into muscle. He grunted and released me, blood blooming across his gray sleeve. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath as I reached for the bypass lever. The metal was frozen shut by years of neglect and humidity. I slammed my fist against the casing, desperate for a spark of life. Above us, the generator let out a dying wheeze and the lights flickered. The entire underground facility groaned under the sudden power surge. The flickering lights revealed something the darkness had hidden in the far corner. A second gurney sat in the shadows, occupied by a figure in a heavy silk dress. I recognized the fabric immediately, because I had seen it in court this morning. My mother wasn't at the police station being processed for her crimes. She was strapped to a table, her eyes wide with a drug-induced terror. Benedict hadn't just experimented on distant relatives. He was harvesting his own mother to save his career. The power balance shifted when Silas stepped into the room. Holding a remote detonator, he looked at Genevieve with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. Silas explained that the clinic was self-destructing to protect the anonymous investors. He offered me a choice. I could save my mother or save the evidence. The digital timer on his device began to glow with a sharp red light. He didn't care about the money anymore. He only cared about erasing the physical witnesses to the Vance legacy. I looked from the timer to my mother's pleading, frantic eyes. She couldn't speak through the sedative, but her tears tracked through her makeup. I reached for the leather folder on the desk, the one containing the clinic's true ledger. If I took the files, she would die in the coming explosion. If I unstrapped her, the proof of Benedict's black market would burn. Silas laughed, a hollow sound that echoed off the chrome walls. He enjoyed the math of my suffering. I chose the folder. I shoved the documents into my jacket and dove toward my mother's gurney. I wasn't leaving her, but I wasn't losing the truth either. I slashed at the leather restraints with the bloodied scalpel. The lead man recovered and lunged at me, his face a mask of rage. I kicked a heavy tray of surgical tools into his path. The clatter of stainless steel bought me the few seconds I needed. My mother's arm came free, and she grabbed my sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong. We stumbled toward the elevator, just as the first ceiling tile buckled. The smell of ozone and burning plastic filled the narrow corridor. I jammed the button for the surface, but the doors remained stubbornly open. Silas stood at the end of the hall, his finger hovering over the final trigger. He told me that the carriage house was already surrounded by his team. Even if we reached the top, there was no way out. The underground prison was becoming a permanent tomb for us all. A sudden explosion rocked the facility from the opposite side of the surgical suite. The floor tilted, throwing Silas against a glass partition that shattered instantly. I saw the detective from the courthouse, Miller, stepping through a hole in the concrete wall. He wasn't alone. A tactical team followed him with weapons drawn. They hadn't followed my car's tracking device for the creditors. They were tracking Silas all along. The chaos provided the perfect cover for our escape. Miller signaled for us to move toward the breach. We crawled through the jagged opening, just as the elevator shaft collapsed behind us. The air outside was sweet and cool compared to the sterile rot below. I looked back at the carriage house and saw the roof cave in. My mother collapsed on the grass, shivering in her ruined silk dress. I patted my jacket to ensure the ledger was still there. It was damp with sweat but intact. Then I saw the man standing by the oaks. Benedict had escaped custody and was watching us. Benedict stood in the shifting shadows of the oak trees, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the burning carriage house. My objective was to secure the ledger and keep my mother away from him. Miller's team was focused on the collapsing structure, their shouts drowned out by the roar of the flames. Benedict didn't look like a prisoner. He wore a clean suit and held a heavy service pistol with steady hands. He had never been processed. He had been waiting for the fire. I pulled my mother behind a thick marble fountain. Her breath hitched in her throat as she saw her favorite son. Benedict didn't call out or offer a plea for mercy. He simply adjusted his grip on the weapon and began to walk toward us. The tactical team was too far away to hear my voice over the snapping timber. I realized that the arrest in court had been part of the theater. The system hadn't failed, it had been bought and paid for by Silas. Benedict stopped 10 paces away, his shadow stretching across the manicured grass. He demanded the ledger I had shoved into my jacket. His voice was calm, devoid of the frantic desperation he had shown in the courtroom earlier. He told me that the offshore investors were already offshore and safely beyond the reach of local law. Only the paper in my pocket could link his name to the illegal surgeries. If I handed it over, he promised to let us both walk away. I looked at the ledger and then at my mother's trembling form. She was staring at Benedict with a mix of terror and a lingering, sick devotion. The power balance shifted when she suddenly stood up and walked toward him. I tried to grab her arm, but she pushed me back with surprising strength. She reached out her hand, begging him to put the gun down and come home. She still believed she could save her golden child from his own darkness. Benedict didn't hesitate or blink as he leveled the barrel at her chest. He told her that she was the biggest liability of all, because she knew too much about the early trials. My mother froze. The realization of his betrayal finally shattering the last of her delusions. He wasn't her son anymore. He was a predator protecting his territory. I reached into my bag for the heavy brass candle snuffer I had grabbed from the library. It was a pathetic weapon. Suddenly, a red laser dot appeared on Benedict's forehead. Miller hadn't missed the movement in the trees after all. A sharp crack echoed through the night air. But it didn't come from the police. Benedict dove for cover as a second black SUV roared up the driveway. These were the actual creditors. And they weren't interested in the ledger or the family drama. They wanted the man who had lost their $15 million. The tactical team scrambled to engage the new threat. The driveway became a chaotic battlefield of crossfire and screaming engines. I grabbed my mother and shoved her toward Miller's van, which was backing up rapidly. Benedict was pinned behind a stone planter, firing wildly at the approaching SUV. He was trapped between the law he had bribed and the monsters he had borrowed from. I saw Silas crawl out from the rubble of the carriage house, his face bloody. He was holding a second detonator. He wasn't finished with the estate. I realized the entire grounds were rigged with secondary charges to erase the evidence. Silas pressed the button, and the ground beneath the main house groaned. A series of muffled thuds vibrated through my boots, followed by the sound of shattering glass. The mansion, the legacy, and the secrets were all being pulled into the earth. I had the ledger, but the physical world was dissolving around us. We had seconds to reach the gate. Miller grabbed my shoulder and pulled me inside. The van sped away as the main estate collapsed into a massive sinkhole. I looked through the rear window and saw the ancient oaks being swallowed by the dirt. Benedict was still standing at the edge of the pit, looking down into the void he had created. He didn't try to run or hide anymore. He simply watched as his empire disappeared into the Georgia clay. The ledger felt heavy and cold against my ribs. I had won the battle for the truth, but the home I fought for was gone. We reached the main road, and the noise of the sirens began to fade. My mother sat in the corner of the van, her eyes vacant and distant. I opened the ledger to the final page to see the names of the investors. My heart stopped when I saw the very first entry at the top of the list. It wasn't a stranger or a faceless corporation. The lead investor was my lawyer, Sarah. She had been the one funding the nightmare all along. The van slowed as we neared the city lights. I stared at Sarah's name in the ledger, my hands trembling against the damp paper. My objective was to alert Detective Miller without tipping off Sarah, who sat directly in the front passenger seat, watching my every move through the glass. She turned her head slightly, her eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror. She offered a supportive smile that now felt like a predatory baring of teeth. The betrayal was total. My protector was actually the architect of my misery. I reached for the door handle, but the child locks were engaged. The obstacle was the very vehicle meant for my rescue. Miller was focused on the road, unaware that his legal consultant was the lead investor in a black market clinic. Sarah reached back and placed a hand on the ledger, her grip firm and possessive. She whispered that everything would be fine now, that the evidence was safe. I felt the cold metal of a syringe pressed against my thigh. The power balance shifted when I realized Miller wasn't a victim of her charm. He adjusted his mirror and met my gaze with a look of profound apology. He wasn't her target, he was her partner. The tactical raid hadn't been to save me, but to ensure the sinkhole swallowed Benedict before he could talk. They needed the ledger to burn. When they saw I had rescued it, the plan changed. I was the only witness left with a paper trail. I didn't panic. I remembered my grandfather's final lesson about the layers of a forgery. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the small recorder I had used in court. I hadn't just saved a book of names. I had captured their entire conversation on the van's internal intercom system. Sarah's face paled as the device began to play her own voice back to her. The subtext of her support was now a recorded confession. I held the power now. Miller slammed on the brakes, sending us jolting forward. He reached for his sidearm. But I was faster. I shoved the ledger into my mother's hands and kicked the back of his seat with everything I had. The van swerved toward a drainage ditch, the tires screaming against the asphalt. Sarah lunged over the seat, but her movements were restricted by the tight space. I managed to roll down the window just as the vehicle came to a halt. I scrambled out into the night air, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. Behind me, the van's headlights cut through the fog, illuminating a second car waiting in the distance. It wasn't the police or the creditors. It was a black sedan with a familiar license plate. My grandfather's lawyer, the only man who hadn't been in the library that day, stepped out with a rifle. He wasn't there to help me either. He was there to collect the final debt. The lawyer raised the rifle, but he wasn't aiming at me. He was aiming at the evidence that could ruin him too. He pulled the trigger, but I dove behind the wheel of the van. The glass shattered. But the recording was already streaming to a remote server he couldn't touch. I stood in the mud, trapped between a sinking legacy and a new circle of wolves. But, for the first time, I had the voices of every monster on a single digital file.